"Get down!" Sarah Collins's voice cut through the chaos as Max lunged, his powerful frame tackling the man reaching for a concealed weapon. The pharmacy erupted into a cacophony of panicked screams and shuffling feet as customers scattered. Max's growl was low and menacing, his sharp teeth inches from the suspect's arm. The suspect froze, his eyes darting to Sarah as she leveled her Glock at him, her steady hands betraying no hint of fear. "You move, he bites," she warned. Her tone was ice cold, but her heart pounded against her ribs. Seconds earlier, she'd entered the airport pharmacy with Max, following his sharp instincts. What should have been a routine patrol had turned into a nightmare the moment Max alerted. Behind the counter, the hidden compartment they'd discovered wasn't just illegal, it was catastrophic. Sarah quickly glanced at the stash, plastic bags of an unidentified powder and vials with biohazard symbols. This wasn't a simple drug bust. It was something far worse. The man pinned under Max chuckled, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're too late, officer. It's already in motion." "What's in motion?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. But the man clamped his mouth shut, refusing to say another word. Before she could push further, her radio crackled. "All units, Terminal C, reports of armed suspects fleeing the area. Possible connection to your current case." Sarah's grip on her radio tightened. The stakes had just skyrocketed. She grabbed the suspect's arm and cuffed him in one swift motion. "Stay down. Backup's coming," she ordered, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "Max, let's move," she called, and her partner immediately released his grip, snapping into position beside her. The two bolted out of the pharmacy and into the chaos of the airport. As they weaved through panicked crowds, Sarah's mind raced. This wasn't just a bust. This was an operation. The kind that didn't stop because one pawn was taken off the board. Up ahead, the terminal doors burst open, and 3 men sprinted toward the tarmac, each carrying heavy black duffel bags. Max barked, his ears pinned back in fierce determination. "Go!" Sarah commanded, and Max took off like a missile, zeroing in on the closest target. The suspect turned to fire a warning shot, but Max was too fast. He leapt, his jaws locking onto the man's arm, dragging him down with a force that sent the duffel bag skidding across the floor. The gun clattered harmlessly away. Sarah didn't hesitate. She closed the gap, taking aim at the second man. "Stop! Drop the bag!" she yelled. He hesitated, but only for a split second before throwing the bag into the back of a waiting van. "Max, hold!" she called out. The dog held the first suspect firmly as Sarah fired a warning shot over the van's hood. The driver slammed the vehicle into reverse, tires screeching as it sped away. The remaining suspect made a desperate break for it. Sarah caught up, tackling him to the ground. "You're not going anywhere," she hissed, yanking his arms behind his back to cuff him. As she hauled him up, her radio crackled again. "Unit K9, possible biohazard breach reported in Hangar 7. All available officers respond immediately." Biohazard. The word echoed in her mind like a warning bell. This wasn't just about drugs or cash, it was bigger, dangerous. She turned to Max, who stood over the subdued suspect, his amber eyes locked on her. "We're not done yet, buddy," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. The chapter closes with Sarah and Max racing toward the unknown threat in Hangar 7, their bond unshaken and the stakes higher than ever. "Get down!" Sarah Collins' voice cut through the chaos like a blade as Max launched himself into the air, a blur of fur and muscle. His jaws clamped onto the arm of a suspect fumbling for a concealed weapon, sending the man crashing to the ground. The sharp crack of the impact silenced the panicked shouts in the airport pharmacy, leaving only the snarling growl of Sarah's K9 partner echoing in the tense air. The suspect froze, his free hand splayed against the floor, eyes wide as Max growled low and steady. Sarah advanced, her Glock aimed squarely at the man's chest. "Don't move!" Her voice was calm, controlled, an officer who had done this many times before. But her racing heart betrayed her instincts, warning her this was no ordinary drug bust. Her eyes flicked to the open cabinet behind the pharmacy counter. What Max had sniffed out wasn't just illegal, it was lethal. Plastic bags of fine white powder and glass vials, marked with international biohazard symbols, gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. This wasn't about recreational drugs. This was something far worse. "You have no idea what you're walking into," the suspect sneered, his lips curling into a sinister grin. His voice was mocking, but Sarah didn't miss the bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "Then start talking," she snapped, stepping closer, her weapon steady. The man's grin widened, but he said nothing. Sarah gritted her teeth. "Max, hold," she commanded. Her partner bared his teeth, his amber eyes locked on the man's face. Before Sarah could press further, her radio crackled to life. "Unit K9, report of armed suspects fleeing through Terminal C. Possible connection to your case. Proceed with caution. Suspects are considered dangerous." Sarah cursed under her breath, holstering her weapon and pulling out handcuffs. She slapped them onto the suspect's wrists in one swift motion. "You're not going anywhere," she growled. Then looking at Max, she said firmly, "Let's move." Max released his grip immediately and fell into step beside her, his posture sharp and ready. The two of them sprinted out of the pharmacy, weaving through a sea of confused travelers, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. The main terminal was chaos. A cacophony of footsteps, rolling luggage, and the distant sound of alarms created a symphony of tension. Sarah scanned the area, her eyes locking on three men sprinting toward an emergency exit. Each carried a heavy black duffel bag, their strides quick and purposeful. "Max, eyes on!" she barked. The dog's ears twitched, his eyes narrowing as he zeroed in on the closest target. The men didn't hesitate. The first suspect reached the door, shoving it open to reveal the tarmac outside. The second tossed his bag to the ground and pulled a handgun from his waistband, aiming back at the pursuing officer. "Max, go!" Sarah shouted. Max surged forward, his paws pounding against the polished floor. The armed man fired a single frantic shot. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the terminal, but Max didn't falter. He leapt, his jaws clamping around the man's forearm, sending the gun clattering to the ground. Sarah was right behind him. She dropped to one knee, grabbing the weapon and securing it before turning her attention to the second man, who was now sprinting toward a waiting van. "Stop! Atlanta PD!" she shouted, but the man ignored her, tossing his bag into the back of the vehicle. The van screeched to life, its tires skidding as it accelerated. Sarah raised her weapon but hesitated. Too many civilians crowded the area. She watched helplessly as the van disappeared into the distance, its taillights fading into the chaos. "Max, hold!" she called out. Max kept the first suspect pinned, his snarls ensuring the man wouldn't dare move. Sarah approached quickly, cuffing the man's free hand to a nearby railing. Her radio crackled again, the urgency in the dispatcher's voice sending chills down her spine. "All units, possible biohazard breach reported in Hangar 7. All available officers respond immediately." Biohazard. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sarah turned to Max, her mind racing. This wasn't just about drugs. Whatever operation they had stumbled into was bigger, dangerous enough to put the entire airport and beyond at risk. "Good work, buddy," she murmured, giving Max a quick pat on his flank. But there was no time to rest. She needed answers, and fast. She grabbed the suspect by the collar, lifting him to his feet. "What's in the bags?" she demanded, her voice sharp. He looked at her with smug defiance, refusing to speak. Max growled low, his body tense, as if he sensed the weight of the danger ahead. Sarah sighed. There was no time to waste. "Fine, we'll find out ourselves." She clipped Max's leash to his harness, and they sprinted toward the exit leading to the hangars. The world around them blurred into a haze of movement and noise, but Sarah's focus was razor sharp. She knew one thing: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The chapter ends as Sarah and Max burst through the doors of the terminal, racing toward Hangar 7, where the true scale of the threat and the fight of their lives awaits them. The wind whipped around Sarah as she and Max bolted across the tarmac, the concrete beneath their feet radiating the heat of the midday sun. Overhead, the deafening roar of departing planes blended with the pounding of her own pulse. Max ran at her side, his leash taut, his gaze locked ahead. Hangar 7 loomed in the distance, its massive sliding doors cracked open just enough to reveal the shadowy interior. As Sarah approached, a black van shot out of the hangar, its tires screeching against the asphalt. The driver didn't hesitate to aim straight for them. "Move!" Sarah shouted, diving to the side and pulling Max with her. The van roared past, missing them by inches. She rolled onto one knee, raising her Glock, but the van zigzagged erratically, making a clear shot impossible. Her frustration mounted as it disappeared into a sea of cargo vehicles and aircraft. "We'll get them," she muttered, standing and brushing herself off. Max barked once, a sharp, eager sound, as if to say he was ready. She smiled faintly. "I know, buddy. Let's find out what they left behind." The hangar smelled of oil and metal, its dimly lit interior cluttered with crates and pallets. Sarah moved cautiously, her weapon drawn, her senses on high alert. Max led the way, his nose working overtime as he sniffed along the edges of the room. "See anything, boy?" she whispered. Max froze, his ears twitching. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Sarah's eyes darted to the far corner, where a man stood hunched over an open crate, frantically shoving packets into a smaller bag. "Freeze!" she barked, training her weapon on him. The man's head snapped up. Without hesitation, he grabbed a glass vial from the crate and hurled it in her direction. It shattered against the ground, releasing a faint acrid mist that made Sarah's throat burn. She coughed, covering her mouth as she advanced, but the man was already sprinting toward the opposite door. "Max, go!" she ordered. Max darted forward like a missile, dodging obstacles with precision. He closed the gap in seconds, leaping onto the suspect and dragging him to the ground. The man cried out in pain, his bag skidding out of reach. Sarah closed in, kicking the bag away and slapping cuffs onto his wrists. "What's in these vials?" she demanded, pulling the man to his feet, his face twisted into a sneer. "You're wasting your time," he spat. "By the time you figure it out, it'll already be too late." Sarah's stomach tightened. She glanced at the shattered vial on the ground, the mist dissipating into the air. Whatever it wasn't just dangerous. It was calculated. The radio on her shoulder crackled. "Collins, we've intercepted chatter. The van is heading toward an airstrip 2 miles east. Possible attempt to leave the country." She relayed the suspect's information and secured him to a nearby beam with a pair of spare cuffs. Then she grabbed the bag he'd been filling and slung it over her shoulder. "You're going to regret keeping quiet," she said before turning to Max. "Let's move." They burst out of the hangar, her legs already aching from the chase, but she didn't slow down. Every second counted. Max's stride matched hers effortlessly, his focus unshakable. The airstrip came into view as they cleared a line of cargo trucks. A small plane sat on the tarmac, its propellers spinning slowly. The black van was parked beside it, the back doors wide open. 4 men were unloading duffel bags, working quickly. "Stop! Atlanta PD!" Sarah yelled, raising her weapon. The men froze for a split second before scattering. One climbed into the plane, another bolted back toward the van, and the remaining 2 grabbed weapons from the bags. "Down!" Sarah shouted, diving for cover behind a cargo pallet. Bullets ricocheted off the metal, the sharp clinks echoing in her ears. Max crouched low beside her, his body tense. She peeked out, firing 2 shots that forced the men to retreat behind the van. "Max, stay!" she ordered, her voice firm. She needed him safe while she dealt with the shooters. Suddenly, the plane's engine roared louder, the propellers spinning faster. Sarah's chest tightened. They were trying to escape. She made a decision. "Max, go for the plane," she commanded, pointing toward the aircraft. Max bolted, weaving through gunfire like a shadow. Sarah covered him, firing at the remaining men and pinning them behind the van. Max reached the plane just as the last suspect was climbing aboard. He leapt, grabbing the man's leg and dragging him back down the steps. The pilot shouted something unintelligible, and the plane began to lurch forward. Max held his ground, teeth locked onto the suspect's boot. The man kicked wildly, but Max didn't let go. Sarah sprinted toward them, adrenaline fueling her every step. She reached the plane just as it began to taxi, grabbing the suspect's arm and yanking him away from the door. The pilot, realizing his cargo was compromised, cut the engine and threw his hands up. Sarah cuffed the suspect and looked down at Max, who panted heavily but wagged his tail. "Good boy," she said, ruffling his fur. "We did it." The relief was short-lived. As backup arrived and the scene was secured, Sarah opened the bag she'd taken from the hangar. Inside were dozens of vials, each labeled with a biohazard symbol, and beneath them a small envelope marked with coordinates. She unfolded the paper, her heart sinking as she read the words scrawled hastily across it. Phase 2 in motion, international transport secured. The chapter ends with Sarah staring at the cryptic message, realizing the operation wasn't just local, it was global. The stakes had just risen, and she and Max were running out of time. The command center at the Atlanta PD buzzed with urgency as Sarah stood in front of a large screen displaying a world map. Red dots marked key locations across Europe, Asia, and South America. The paper she had found in the bag was now spread out on the table, its cryptic coordinates matching the locations displayed on the screen. "This isn't just an operation," Sarah said, her voice tight. "This is a network." Captain Harris, a grizzled veteran with decades of experience, nodded grimly. "And we just uncovered the tip of it. Customs confirmed the vials are carrying a synthetic biological agent, something engineered. It's not just dangerous, it's catastrophic." The words hit Sarah like a punch. "What kind of agent?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "Early tests suggest it's airborne, with a rapid transmission rate," Harris replied. "The good news, it's inert in its current form, but if it's activated..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Max lay at her feet, his amber eyes fixed on her as though sensing her unease. Sarah crouched to scratch behind his ears, finding brief solace in the simple act. "We need to find where they're taking it," she said firmly, standing up. "We can't wait for them to make the first move." Harris gestured to the map. Interpol flagged a private jet, matching the description of the van's crew. It left from a remote airstrip north of here, last pinged heading toward the Middle East. Sarah's stomach churned. "So they're out of the country, for now," Harris replied. But we have one edge. They don't know you've got this." He tapped the bag of confiscated vials. Hours later, Sarah and Max were aboard a transport plane en route to Istanbul. The cabin hummed with the steady drone of the engines. Max lay curled at her feet, his breathing even and calm, a stark contrast to her restless thoughts. She kept replaying the events of the last 24 hours, the chase, the vials, the cryptic message. "Why Istanbul?" she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. The message had mentioned international transport, and Istanbul was a hub that connected Europe and Asia. If the network wanted to spread their agent, this was the perfect place to start. Her thoughts were interrupted by the pilot's voice over the intercom. "Touchdown in 5. Local authorities will meet you at the hangar." As the plane landed, Sarah tightened Max's harness, checking the reflective tags that read K9 Unit. "Ready, buddy?" she asked. Max barked softly, his eyes sharp and alert. The air in Istanbul was thick with humidity as they stepped off the plane. A local officer greeted them with a brief nod. "Detective Collins, welcome. We've secured the area based on your intel. The coordinates point to a warehouse in the port district. It's heavily guarded." "Let's move," Sarah said, not wasting a second. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette framed by the glow of distant city lights. The team stopped just short of the perimeter, using the cover of stacked shipping containers. Sarah adjusted her earpiece. "Do we have eyes inside?" "Thermal imaging shows a group of at least 10, came the reply from a technician stationed nearby. "They're loading crates into trucks." Max sniffed the air, his body stiffening. Sarah knew what that meant. There was something dangerous in those crates. She signaled the team to move in. The first breach was swift, officers storming the warehouse from multiple entrances. Sarah and Max took the west side, moving quickly but cautiously. Max's ears were perked, his posture rigid as he led the way. Inside, the scene was chaos. Men shouted in a mix of languages as they scrambled to defend their operation. A gunshot rang out, and Sarah dove behind a crate, dragging Max with her. She peeked out, spotting two suspects firing from an elevated platform. "Stay," she commanded Max before rolling out and firing. Her shots forced the men to retreat, giving her a chance to move closer. Max barked sharply, a warning. She turned just in time to see a third suspect emerging from behind a stack of crates, a weapon raised. Max didn't wait for her command. He lunged, knocking the man to the ground and disarming him with a swift bite to the wrist. "Good boy!" Sarah shouted, rushing over to secure the suspect. She looked up to see the other officers subduing the remaining men. The operation seemed under control until she spotted the trucks. One of the vehicles was already moving, its engine revving loudly as it sped toward the warehouse exit. "Stop that truck!" Sarah yelled into her radio, sprinting after it. Max bolted ahead, his powerful legs eating up the distance. The truck was gaining speed, but Max was relentless, closing the gap with every stride. The driver swerved, trying to shake him off, but Max leapt onto the side, his claws gripping the metal frame. Sarah could barely breathe as she chased them, her legs burning with the effort. "Hold on, Max!" she shouted, drawing her weapon. A well-placed shot took out one of the truck's tires. The vehicle skidded, fishtailing wildly before coming to a stop. Max jumped clear, landing gracefully as the driver scrambled out, hands raised in surrender. Back at the port, the aftermath was tense. The crates were opened under the supervision of hazmat teams, revealing more vials of the biohazard agent. Sarah watched as they were carefully catalogued, her relief tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. One of the officers approached her, holding a phone they'd confiscated from the driver. "Detective, you'll want to see this." The screen displayed a live feed of a laboratory. Scientists in protective gear worked methodically, their movements deliberate. In the corner of the frame, a clock counted down. Ward 2315. 23 minutes, Sarah muttered. Her heart raced as she turned to Max. "We're not done yet." The chapter ends with Sarah and Max racing against time to stop whatever the countdown is leading to, the stakes higher than ever as the network's true scale begins to reveal itself. The laboratory clock's relentless countdown loomed in Sarah's mind as she and Max sprinted through the chaotic port district. Istanbul's streets were a maze of narrow alleys, ancient stone facades, and bustling vendors who barely blinked at the urgency in Sarah's stride. Max kept pace, his nose to the ground as they followed the trail left by the suspect's phone GPS ping. 23 minutes, she muttered under her breath. The lab on the live feed could be anywhere, but the signal from the phone had narrowed their search radius. Every second mattered. Her radio crackled. "Detective Collins, local authorities confirm the signal is originating from an industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. Units are en route, but traffic is slowing us down." "Understood," Sarah replied tersely. She couldn't wait for backup. If the countdown hit 0 before they arrived, the consequences would be unthinkable. The industrial complex was an imposing sight, a cluster of steel structures and smokestacks silhouetted against the night sky. Sarah and Max approached silently, moving along the perimeter. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning fuel. A single guard stood at the entrance, his posture relaxed as he lit a cigarette. Max stiffened, his ears swiveling forward. Sarah crouched beside him, her hand tightening on his harness. "Easy, boy," she whispered. She raised her Glock, her focus locking onto the guard's movements. The man turned his back, oblivious to the danger. Sarah seized the moment, moving swiftly. She disarmed him with a single, fluid motion, forcing him to the ground. Max stood by her side, his growl low and menacing. "Where's the lab?" Sarah demanded. The man stared at her, defiant, but Max's growl deepened. His sharp teeth glinted in the faint light, and the guard cracked. "Third building on the left," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Second floor." Sarah knocked him unconscious with a quick blow and secured him to a nearby pipe. "Good boy," she murmured to Max, giving him a quick scratch behind the ears. "Let's move." The building was eerily quiet as they entered. The walls were bare steel, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the empty corridors. Max led the way, his nose twitching as he followed the faint chemical scent. At the top of the stairs, Sarah paused. She could hear muffled voices beyond the door at the end of the hall. Her heart raced as she glanced at her watch. 12 minutes left. "Stay close," she whispered. Max pressed against her leg, his body coiled like a spring. She moved carefully, her gun raised, her steps silent against the cold floor. Inside, the lab was a hive of activity. Scientists in hazmat suits worked feverishly at their stations. Vials and syringes scattered across the countertops. Monitors displayed complex chemical equations alongside the countdown timer. 10:24. Sarah scanned the room. Near the far wall, a man stood apart from the chaos. He wore no protective gear, his tailored suit an unsettling contrast to the sterile environment. His eyes met Sarah's and he smiled, a cold, calculated expression. "You're too late," he said, his voice calm. "You've stopped nothing." "We'll see about that," Sarah replied, stepping forward. "Everyone, hands where I can see them, now!" The scientists froze, their hands hovering over their instruments. The man in the suit didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for a nearby console, his hand hovering over a switch. "Don't," Sarah warned, her weapon aimed at his chest. He smirked. "You can't stop progress." Before she could react, his hand slammed down on the switch. Alarms blared as red lights bathed the room. The countdown accelerated, the numbers ticking down twice as fast. 05:12. Sarah fired, the bullet striking his shoulder and sending him sprawling. He clutched the wound, but his laughter echoed over the chaos. "It doesn't matter, the chain reaction is irreversible." Sarah's stomach twisted. Max barked sharply, drawing her attention to a workstation where the countdown interface blinked furiously. "Good eye," she said, rushing over. The system was incomprehensible, a labyrinth of technical jargon and encrypted commands. "I need a tech team in here," she barked into her radio. "ETA 3 minutes, came the reply. 02:56. "Not soon enough," she muttered. Her eyes darted over the controls. Next to the interface was a small glass vial, its contents glowing faintly. Beneath it a label read, "Catalyst." "Max, stay!" she commanded, grabbing the vial. The man in the suit lunged toward her, but Max intercepted him with a ferocious growl, pinning him to the floor. Sarah held the vial aloft. "This is the trigger, isn't it?" she shouted. The man gritted his teeth. "You wouldn't dare." Without hesitation, Sarah hurled the vial to the floor. It shattered, the glowing substance sizzling as it met the cold steel. The alarm stopped abruptly, the countdown freezing at 01:12. The room fell silent, except for the ragged breaths of the pinned suspect and Sarah's pounding heartbeat. Backup burst through the door moments later, securing the lab and apprehending the remaining scientists. Later, as the lab was cleared and evidence catalogued, Sarah knelt beside Max, who panted happily, his tail thumping against the floor. "Once again, you saved the day," she said, scratching under his chin. He licked her hand in response, his eyes filled with trust. Captain Harris's voice came through her radio. "Collins, excellent work. We've neutralized the immediate threat, but intel from the lab suggests this was only one of several hubs. We're tracing leads now." Sarah sighed, exhaustion catching up with her. "Understood, Captain." As she looked at Max, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The network was vast, its reach global, and she and Max had just become its greatest threat. The chapter ends with Sarah and Max leaving the complex, the distant sound of sirens echoing through the Istanbul night. Their bond stronger than ever, they prepare for the battles yet to come. The sound of the jet engines faded as Sarah and Max descended onto a remote airstrip deep in Eastern Europe. The frigid air bit at Sarah's face, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on the encrypted files retrieved from the Istanbul lab. They had led her here, to a facility nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, one of the suspected command centers for the entire network. "Collins, this is the heart of it," Captain Harris had said during their last briefing. They know we're onto them, so expect heavy resistance. Whatever's left here could dismantle the entire operation. Sarah tightened Max's harness. "This is it, buddy," she whispered. His ears twitched in acknowledgement, his eyes sharp and ready. The facility was buried deep within the forest, its entrance obscured by a wall of jagged rocks. Sarah and Max moved silently, their steps muffled by the thick snow. She raised her binoculars, scanning the perimeter. Guards armed with automatic rifles patrolled in tight formations. "We're not sneaking in the front door," Sarah muttered. Max let out a soft whine, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. They circled the facility until Max stopped, his body tense. Sarah crouched beside him and spotted a vent partially hidden behind a thicket of trees. It was narrow, but just wide enough for Max. "All right, partner, you're up," she said, unscrewing the vent cover. Max crawled inside, his movements silent and deliberate. Sarah followed closely, her Glock drawn. The vents opened into a dimly lit corridor, the air thick with the hum of machinery. Max led the way, his nose working overtime. Sarah's pulse quickened as she followed him through the labyrinth of hallways. Every sound, a distant clang of metal, the murmur of voices, set her nerves on edge. Max froze suddenly, his ears swiveling. Sarah crouched beside him, peering around the corner. Two guards stood outside a reinforced door, their weapons slung lazily over their shoulders. "Good boy," she whispered. "Now let's give them a distraction." She reached into her pouch, pulling out a small flashbang. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it into the hallway. The device clattered against the floor, and before the guards could react, it detonated with a blinding flash and a deafening bang. Max shot forward, his powerful frame barreling into the dazed guards. Sarah followed, disarming the first guard with a swift kick and delivering a sharp elbow to the second. Both men were on the ground before they could fully recover. Inside the room, a wall of monitors displayed live feeds from around the world. Ports, airports, and cities flashed on the screens, each marked with cryptic timestamps and coordinates. At the center of it all was a terminal connected to a massive server. Sarah's stomach tightened. This was the nerve center of the operation. "All right, let's see what you've got," she muttered, pulling out a portable decryption device and plugging it into the terminal. The screen flickered as the device began extracting files. Max growled softly, drawing her attention to the doorway. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder. She glanced at the progress bar. 42%. Come on, she muttered. The footsteps were closer now. She could hear voices, barking orders in a language she didn't understand. The bar ticked to 70%. "Max, defend!" she commanded, her voice low but firm. Max moved to the doorway, his body blocking the entrance. Sarah turned her attention back to the terminal, her hands flying across the keyboard. The files were encrypted, but the decryption device was working overtime. The first guard appeared in the doorway, his weapon raised. Max lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's forearm. The gun clattered to the ground as the guard screamed, trying to shake Max off. A second guard appeared, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She fired, dropping him with a single shot. The bar hit 100%. "Got it!" she shouted, yanking the device free. She whistled sharply. "Max, let's go!" Max released the first guard, who crumpled to the ground, clutching his arm. Together they bolted from the room, the sound of reinforcements echoing behind them. The forest was a blur as Sarah and Max sprinted through the snow, the distant shouts of guards growing fainter. They reached the extraction point just as the helicopter descended, its blades kicking up a storm of powder. Sarah climbed aboard, pulling Max up behind her. As the helicopter lifted off, she looked down at the facility, now a distant speck in the sea of white. The files she'd recovered would dismantle the operation, but her relief was short-lived. "Captain," she said over the comms, "the files mention something called the Catalyst Deployment Schedule. There are more labs, and they're operational." Harris's voice was grim. "Understood, Collins. Get back to base. We'll regroup and plan the next move." Sarah leaned back, her hand resting on Max's head. His steady breathing was a comfort in the midst of the storm. "Looks like we're not done yet, buddy," she said softly. The chapter ends with Sarah and Max flying toward an uncertain future, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. The fight isn't over, and the clock is still ticking. The tactical command center was buzzing with activity as Sarah entered, Max at her side. Monitors displayed maps, intercepted communications, and real-time footage from operatives on the ground. Sarah dropped the decrypted drive onto the table, the weight of its contents settling heavily on her shoulders. "Captain Harris, it's worse than we thought," she said, pulling up the files. "The Catalyst deployment schedule isn't just a blueprint, it's active. 4 facilities worldwide are set to deploy the agent within the next 12 hours. Harris leaned over the table, his brow furrowed. "Locations?" Sarah pointed to the highlighted coordinates. "Rio de Janeiro, Hong Kong, Johannesburg, and Los Angeles. Each site is timed to create maximum chaos and spread." The room went silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. "How do we stop this?" Harris asked. Sarah's jaw tightened. "We divide and conquer. Max and I will take Los Angeles. That site's the last on the schedule. If we fail there, containment is impossible." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "You'll have support, but it'll be limited. Most of our resources are tied up in the other locations." "That's all we need," Sarah replied, glancing down at Max. His amber eyes gleamed with determination. The flight to Los Angeles was tense, the hours slipping away as Sarah reviewed the intel. The facility was hidden within an industrial district near the port, its operations disguised as a chemical storage site. The files indicated a team of armed guards, sophisticated security measures, and most chillingly, an automated release mechanism set to trigger if the site was compromised. Sarah scratched Max behind the ears as the plane descended. "No room for mistakes, buddy," she murmured. Max licked her hand in response, his silent promise to stay by her side no matter what. The facility was a sprawling maze of warehouses, its exterior nondescript but heavily guarded. Sarah and Max approached under the cover of darkness, weaving between stacks of shipping containers. Her earpiece crackled as the support team checked in. "Collins, we're in position on the south side. Distraction ready on your go." Sarah pressed a hand to her earpiece. "Hold for now. We'll move first." Max froze suddenly, his body low to the ground. Sarah followed his gaze, spotting a pair of guards patrolling the perimeter. She signaled to Max, who darted forward, silent as a shadow. The guards didn't see him until it was too late. Max lunged, taking one down with a precise strike, while Sarah subdued the second with a swift blow to the head. "Good work," she whispered, patting Max before moving toward the facility's entrance. Inside, the air was heavy with the hum of machinery. Vats of chemicals lined the walls, their contents glowing faintly. In the center of the room stood a towering machine, its interface displaying a countdown. 01:37:52. "Bingo," Sarah muttered. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning for traps. Max stayed close, his nose twitching as he sniffed for hidden dangers. The interface was complex, a web of encrypted commands and failsafes. Sarah's heart sank as she realized how little time she had to disable it. She plugged in her decryption device, praying it would work quickly. Her radio crackled. "Collins, movement outside. Reinforcements incoming." "Hold them off as long as you can," she replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The device worked furiously, but the progress bar crawled. "Come on, come on!" A distant door slammed open, followed by the echo of boots on steel. Sarah glanced at Max. "Defend!" she ordered, her voice firm. Max darted to the doorway, his growl echoing through the room. The first guard to enter didn't stand a chance. Max leapt, knocking the man's weapon aside and pinning him to the ground. More followed, but Max held his ground, his movements precise and relentless. The decryption device finally chimed. The countdown froze at 00:47:13. Sarah exhaled sharply, but her relief was short-lived. The screen flashed a new warning. "Manual override required for full shutdown." "Of course," Sarah muttered, spotting a panel on the far wall. She sprinted toward it, dodging stray bullets as the reinforcements pushed harder. Max barked sharply, warning her of an approaching guard. She turned, firing a single shot that dropped the man before he could take aim. Reaching the panel, she yanked it open. Inside was a tangle of wires and switches, each labeled in cryptic code. "Great," she muttered. "Which one stops the apocalypse?" She heard footsteps behind her and turned just in time to see a figure raise a weapon. But before she could react, Max was there, his powerful jaws clamping onto the attacker's arm. The man screamed, dropping his gun as Max forced him to the ground. "Good boy," Sarah shouted, her focus snapping back to the panel. She followed the diagram etched inside, her hands working quickly to cut and reconnect wires. The machine emitted a shrill alarm, but after a tense moment, the lights dimmed and the hum of the machinery died. The countdown disappeared. It was over. The aftermath was a blur. Backup arrived to secure the facility and detain the remaining operatives. The biohazard agent was neutralized, and the chemical vats were destroyed under strict containment protocols. Sarah knelt beside Max, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. "You did it, partner," she said softly. Max leaned into her, his tail wagging weakly. Captain Harris's voice came over her radio. "Collins, all sites neutralized, it's over." Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief, but her mind was already racing. The network might be dismantled, but the scars it left behind would linger. As she and Max stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of what they had accomplished and what they had prevented settled over her. She looked down at her loyal partner, his amber eyes meeting hers with unwavering trust. "Come on, Max," she said. "Let's go home." The chapter ends with Sarah and Max walking toward their extraction point, their bond stronger than ever. Though the mission is over, they know there will always be another battle to fight, and they'll face it together.